Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. We are on the pattern number 16 and it is an inverted K pattern, and this is an intermediate pattern that we will be solving today. So when you first look at the pattern, the first thing I see is that it can be divided up into two parts. I'm thinking we could use 3 for loops for the first part, and then we could also use 3 for loops for the bottom half. So let's get started. And of course we have our scanner. So if you've been following us and you've been following along the pattern, you know how the scanner works. We created an object of the scanner. We asked the users how many rows they would like to print, and then we take that number as an integer called num. We said, great, here is your pattern, and I added a line to print between the sentence and the actual pattern. So as usual, we're going to start with our first for loop, and this first for loop print our rows. And where does our row begin? If we look at our pattern carefully, our rows begin at 1 and it ends at whatever the user input. So we have our rows begin at 1 and it's less than and equal to whatever our user input is, which is num. Now let's print our next for loop, and we're just doing this for loop to print our blank spaces. Okay, so now let's look at where our spaces start. Our spaces start at 1 and it ends at whatever I is. So we could say that j is equal to 1 and j is less than I, because if you look at the pattern, the blank spaces is less than whatever the row number is. So that is for our blank columns, and we're going to print just the space. And again, this is a print statement and not a print ln. Now let's proceed on to our next for loop. Okay, and for this for loop, this is going to print our numbered columns. So the value of our columns will be printed here. Okay, and where does our numbered column starts? If we look at it carefully, our number column starts at whatever I is. So in this row, row 1, I is 1 and our column is 1. In row 2, I starts at 2 and our column starts at 2. So to make this less complicated, we could say j is equal to I, okay, and j is less than and equal to num. And then we're going to say j plus plus. And then we're going to print j. So a little bit different here, because if you notice, there are no spaces in between our pattern, no spaces. So we're not going to print a space. Okay, and that is our first part of the pattern. Let's print it to see what happens. Okay, how many rows would you like to print? I'm going to say 7. Okay, that looks like the first part of our pattern. So we know that the first part of our pattern is correct because it does look like the first part of the pattern if we break it here. Now let's go ahead and print the second part of our pattern. Now something very important to note, this is the end of our first for loop. Okay, and we have 2 nested for loops in here. So now let's go on to, we have to create another for loop, and we're going to nest 2 other loops inside that for loop. So this is called nested loop, just in case you wanted to know. Now let's look at our I loop here, where we're printing the rows. If we look at this loop for the second half of the pattern here, if we look at the second half of the pattern, we notice that it starts from row number 6. We know that because we already established that the column number is the same number as the row number. So we notice that it starts from row number 6. How are we going to say that in coding terms? So we're going to say I is equal to num minus 1. So I is going to be equal to the user input minus 1. So that's only going to print 6 rows. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to say I is greater than and equal to 1. And then I decrements. Why does I decrement? If we look at our pattern, the second half of the pattern, I does go down. It goes from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay? So that controls the rows, and the rows go down in value as we go on. Now let's print our second for loop. This is a nested loop, and this is our J loop. And again, this takes care of our blank columns. So for this J loop, J is equal to 1, okay? And our spaces again is J is less than and equal to I. That doesn't change, J plus plus. And then we're going to print a blank space. So this is the same code from above. Now, let us go ahead and print our numbered columns now. Okay, so for our numbered columns, where do they start? Let's go back to our pattern. Our numbered columns, for simplicity purposes, start where whatever I is, that's the same value of the column, and then it goes up in value. So we have 6, 7, and then we have 5, 6, 7. So the one thing we're noticing is that whatever I is, so J is going to be equal to I. And J is less than and equal to num. And we said J went up in value, so we're going to say J plus plus. Now let's print J. And we're not going to add. Let's print J, and we're not going to add spaces this time because we do want our pattern to print correctly. And then we're just going to print a line. Let's label our for loops. And this is what the code looks like. Let's run our code. How many rows would you like to print? I'm going to say 7. And there is our pattern. And there you have it. That is our pattern. So I'm going to slowly scroll through this code here so you could have like a closer look at it. Okay, this is the first half. This is the second half. Thank you guys so much for joining me today for pattern number 16. In our next episode, we're going to print pattern number 17. Thank you so much. And again, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Have a great day.